Now that we have the first data ready, we can pass it on to our chart component. We don't need the use effect. I just used it to show you that the data works. So let's include our simple first graph component in our widget. Then we can pass the data. So we're going to create inside our simple force graph, we'll create a prop that we'll call data, and that's going to be our first force data. And then we can pass some variable to align it. We can pass the width, we can put it as 800, and we can pass the height. We can set it as 350. Then another thing we need to do is we need to create some kind of method that once the one of the node is selected, we want to be able to pass it back to our parent component. So what we can do is we can create a constant, and we can call it selected index, and put a set selected index setter, and that would be a use state React hook, and then we can set it with initial value of 0. And then what we can do is we can use that the set selected index, just like we did in our component in our previous 2 lesson with the bubble, and we can create another prop in our simple force graph, and we can call it on node selected, and then bind it to our function like so. And now we can implement those properties in our simple force graph component. So go to the end, and let's implement those. We can, for the force data, this is going to be of type. We can use types.dataObject. For the width, it's going to be of type number, the height of type number, and for the on node selected, that's going to be of type dispatch. This is the React type for use state setter. So it would be a React dispatch, and it's going to be a set state action. I checked those out at the docs to kind of find out the type, so we can implement that. Let's see, we need to import the types. Great. Then another thing we need is, if you remember when we built the bubble component, we had to clone the object. The reason we had to clone the object, our data object, is because D3 was extending the object and adding properties on it. So we cannot use a binding object that's connected to React to do that, and we had to clone the object. And the same here, when we simulate the force, we're gonna have to pass the clone object, because we cannot have those being extended by the original object. Let's make sure we don't have any errors. Okay, looking good. We can also already put a script that will show the selected item. So I'm just gonna put a div, and we're gonna call it selected index. So that will, once we selected an index, it's gonna pass it back to our parent component, the network widget, and then we can display it for the user. Okay, there you go. Just make sure there's no errors. Let's see. I'm getting an error because it took out, first of all, when we have a div, we don't need anymore the opening and closing tags, so we can get rid of them. Let's see. The div is closing here, so we can put another div element on the top to open and close, and we can align it better so it doesn't complain. Okay, looking good. Just make sure there's no errors. There's one error. It's the indent. Okay, the simple force chart needs to be aligned with the div, so I'm going to pull it back. And the same with the closing tag, has to be aligned. Great, no errors. Now go back to the simple force graph, and we'll go back to the top. What we need to do is we need to set the state. So our state, we added a variable, if you remember at the end, look at the end, we added that clone data. So we need to initialize that in the state, otherwise it's going to throw errors. And what we can do is we can just use JSON parse, and then we can pass the JSON stringify of our prop data, and that will create a clone and will allow us to extend the object, which D3 needs to do. We don't need the reference, we're not going to use that, so we can clean it up. We can clean up the everything out of our return JSX for now. Let's clean everything up. Okay, and let's go back up, get rid of all those reference statements, get rid of everything inside of component did mount. Let's just do some cleanups. The imports, anything we're not using, we can clean it up. Okay, let's add our simulation. So if you remember, in the bubble chart, we created the simulation and put it as a private member. So we can do the same here. Simulation, it's a D3 force. And if you remember, we imported that in the beginning, in the previous section. And that's going to be of type simulation node dtom, or it could be, we want to let it be undefined. And we can add at the end that it could be undefined. That way we don't have to define it in the beginning, because we want D3 to do this. It wants us to fix the imports. Let's fix those. We don't need the yarn command. Then another thing, you see if you hover over the clone data, we're not using it, so it looks like it's an error, but it's not really an error. It's just because we're not using it. Then the next thing we want to do is we want to create that simulate position method, which is similar to what we've done again with the bubble chart, power chart. So we can create a method, and let's call it simulate positions, and then we can use D3 to kind of create a script that will simulate the position. So we need to use this simulation that we created as a private at the top, and then we can use D3, and we can start defining everything. First of all, just like with transition, we need to tell D3, hey, this is a force simulation, so it knows what we're doing. Then we need to set the nodes. So we need to pass the nodes that we're going to be using. So what we can do is we can use our state, because again, we don't want to use the actual data, we want to use the clone data. So we can put a question mark just to make sure that it already has data, and then we'll use the nodes. And after that, we need to cast it as simulate data dtom array, and that we're giving D3 the clone data to kind of manipulate that and do whatever it needs to add the properties that it needs. And then we need to create a force, and in the force we're going to define the link, and the link we're going to use D3. D3 has a method for force link, so we can call force link, and it needs an ID. So for the ID we're going to pass on the data and an inline method to handle that, and the inline method is just going to return our data as types node and then the name. So we'll use that for our ID, and then we need to tell it the distance. So for the distance, what we can do is we can create a prop, and the same with the strength. So we need to set the strength. So we need to set the strength and the distance. And what we can do is we can also add the property on the props for the distance and the strength. So we don't have it yet. I'm just going to create it for us, and then we can go back down to the interface and just edit. So distance, and both of them are going to be of type number, and this way we can control those links, the distance and the strength of the power we're using. This way, just much better designed than hard coding it. So we need to go back to our widget, network widget, and then we added those two properties, so we need to add them to our component. So for the distance as initial value, we can use 80, and for the strength we can use 1. And what we can do, just so it's a little bit more clear what's the distance is off and what's the strength is off, I can just refactor that to be link distance, and the same with the strength. So I'm just going to refactor it so the name will make more sense. I like to use Shakespearean and naming convention, so the name really tells you what it's all about. So I got those refactored. Now we can go back to our simulation, and let's see if we're missing something. Yeah, everything looks good. The only thing we need to do, we need to kind of use the callback to kind of attach the force to the link. So what we need to do is that what we just created, we need to just call it out. So we can just use this simulation, and then we can use the force we just created that we named it link, and we need to pass the links, and the links are going to be this state. Again, we need to use the cloned data, and if it exists, then we need to use the links. Okay, now it's giving me an error because it could possibly be undefined. Because if you remember the simulation, we're not setting it up in the beginning, so we'll just suppress that because we know it's going to get set up. So this is like a certain case that we really can't escape using tsignore unless we can do it, but it's just a lot of work and it's not worth it. So I'll just use the tsignore. Couple more things we can do in terms of the force. We can use a couple of more force. We can do force for the charge, and we can do, oops, I put it inside of the other force. we can do force for the charge, and then we can also do force for to force it back to the center. So this is like really our animation, and we're telling D3 how we want to handle that. So in terms of the charge, what we can do is we can use the D3. It has a method force many body, because we're using many elements. We want to do it for all of them, and then we can set the strength of that, and then what we can do is we can bake a value here, but instead of baking a value, we can also pass it as a prop. So we can call a prop, we'll set a prop and we can call it charge strength. That would be a good name. And then the same for the center. So what we can do is we can use, we can give it a name, the center, and then we can use the D3, and it also has a force center. And you can play around with those functions that D3 has, how it would collide and all that stuff. So this is, you can create a different types of collision, depends on what you're trying to achieve. And then we can also give it as a prop, and we can, this is really how the width of the center for those nodes is going to be. So we can call it center width. And now we can also pass those two values back into our interface. ENGH, okay, and the center width, we can pass it, and both of them are going to be of type number. And now we need to set it in our network widget as well. Okay, it actually looked like I had a typo. It's TH. Okay, so the strength, the charge strength, I'm going to give it a negative value, so it's going to bring it back. And we need the center width. For the center width, I can give it a 350 value. Let's just fix the strength back in our simple force chart component. Okay. Look, we got an error. Because we need the typo, the charge strength. And when we do the center, we can do both. We can pass the width and we can pass the height. So let's add another one for the height, for the center height. And that's going to be of type number. And let's go back to the network widget and add a center height. And as initial value, we can give it initial value of, let's say, 170. There you go. Make sure we don't have any errors. Okay, great. Let's look again at our simulate positions, and you could see what's happening. We're creating a name, we call it a link, and then we're doing a force link, and we're setting up the type of charges that we want. We want it to charge, and then we want it to come back to the center, and then we use our simulation with the link that we created, that simulation link, and then we pass in the clone data because it's going to extend it, and we need to make sure it's we're not using the original data. Now that we have our simulate position ready, we can use it at the event lifecycle of the class component. So the first place we want to do it is when the component mounts. So we want to call it this and simulate position. Then another place we want to call it is if there is an update. So component did update. We want to do it here as well. So on every update, we want to call the simulate position. Then, if you remember in the bubble chart, we put the check and the clone in the component did update, but a better place to do it in this component is inside of the render. And a lot of people forget that actually the render is part of the event lifecycle of React. So this is going to get called on every render. So we can put that check if there's an update to our data and update our clone data, we can actually put it right here. So we can check if this props data is different than the new one. This is the new one, right? The prop data, and then we can compare it to the old one. And the old one, we set it already at the constructor as the state. So we can compare the state with the new one which will get assigned to the prop data. So if it's different, right, then we can set a new state. Let's just put brackets. So this set state, and then we can pass the new state. So the clone data, and then we can use again the parse method of JSON, just like what we did when we set the component to equal this props and the data. There you go. So this way, every time there's a change in the data that coming from the parent's component, it's going to re-render our component here. And now what we want to do, we want to start working on start rendering our container. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to create an SVG tag to kind of wrap everything in. And we'll give it some properties. We can give it an X and Y properties of 0 and 0. I think the default is 0, so you may not have to do it, but I like to put it there just in case we want to change it. And then we want to set also the width and height and the transform. So let's set up the width, and that's going to equal the width that we're passing from the props, and the same with the height. We can pass it from the prop, and a neat way to kind of do that is to create a constant. So we can create a constant to equal this props, and then assign the width and the height like that, instead of keep typing this prop. It's just a neater way to kind of work with React and the props. Okay. And then the last thing we need to work with is with the translate. So we can set an initial translate state that we can assign it to our translate. And we can set it to the top left corner, so that would be 0, 0. And now we can set our transform to our translate and use that initial translate method constant that we created. We need to pass the 0 for the top left. So we could have just typed 0, 0, but doing it this way will allow us to easily make changes or even tie it up to the prop if we want to. And then we also need to, once we do that, then we can tie it up with this, so we can actually scale that as well. So if we do a scale after the translate, that will scale it as well. So what we can do is we can set a constant for initial scale as well. So for initial scale, we can scale it as just as 1. So initial scale will equal 1. So after the translate, if we do the scale, we can pass our initial scale, and everything being as a constant, a variable, that's gonna just make our life much easier if we need to make changes. Here it wants us to close the SVG because we don't have any other item. Okay, so now that we have the SVG ready, what we want to do is we want to put in the links, the circles, and the labels. And as you've seen before, what we did with the function component, we kind of let D3 take over, but now I'm going to show you another approach, and this time instead of letting D3 take over, we're going to create those components in JSX and tie them into our return JSX method. This way it's completely controlled by React and it's just more readable. So this way we don't need to worry about the DOM updating when it needs to. So it's just another approach of how to handle the DOM with React and D3. Let's collapse the left side of the IDE and target our component. Okay, I am getting a couple of errors here because it needs to, the SVG needs to collapse at the same location. Let's see what else. And we can't use, you see in our component did update, the ESLint is set not to use any, but we actually don't need that snapshot parameter, so I can take that off. Okay, so I cleaned up all the errors. I'm back at the return render, and let's collapse the SVG like that. And now we can add those elements. So we can start with the links. So we can create inside of our simple force graph folder. I'm going to create another file and I'm going to call it links.tsx TypeScript. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to export the default. I'm going to create a pure component. So a class pure component, and let's call it links. And that's going to extend React pure. And you remember what I told you? Whenever you can, use pure component over component. And what we can do is we can pass in the links. And that's going to be of types link. So we can pass in the links parameter. And then inside, I'm not gonna, we're just gonna do an empty rendering with an empty tag. We'll just set up the file first and then we'll handle it. So for the render, I'm just gonna collapse open and close tag. Okay. Because it's a, we need to do a return, or I need to do a return inside the render because it's a class. I can do it like this. Just make sure we don't have any errors. We get an error because React is not imported. So we need to make sure React is imported and the types needs to be imported from our types file. Okay, so we just got the links, and we need to do the same for the circle and for the labels. Let's create a component for the circles. So we'll call it circles.tsx, and I'll just use the same scaffolding from links. I'll just change the class name to circles, and for the props, we can create our own crop. So I'm just gonna get rid of this object from the prop object, and we can call it I circles props, and then at the end of the document we can define it, interface I circle props, and that's going to be of type. For now I'm only going to pass the nodes, so we can take it from our types file, and it's an array of the nodes, so we can start creating those nodes. And then the same for the labels. Let's create a new class for the labels. We'll call it labels.tsx, and I'm going to use again the same code from links, just change the class to labels, and create a custom interface. So we'll call it I labels props, and in the I label props we're also going to need the nodes, so we can create an interface and just set for now the nodes that will be of types node array. Okay, so now we have the labels, circles, and links, and we can attach it to our simple force graph SVG. So let's add them to our SVG. Links, there you go, and circles and labels. And now we can bind our data. We need to bind the clone data because it has the properties that d3 extend. So clone data and pass links, and the same with the nodes. Nodes. Okay, we may have to convert it. No, it's not throwing an error, so we don't need to convert it. Now let's start work on each of those components. For the links, we're passing the links array. So what we need to do, we need to map through that array and then start drawing those links. So what we can do is we can create a constant and call it links, and then pass the props with our links, and then map each link. There you go, and it's going to be a link of types link. Okay, and now what we can do is we can map through all the links to generate a G class, a group of all those links that it's going to be passed back as our parent component. So inside here, we're just going to pass in the links. Okay, and now we need to create another component that we can use to kind of pass on the link. So I'll show you how we do it. We just go over here to the simple force graph and create another file, and let's call it link.tsx, and then create another. This time we can create a class component, so this way we can hook into the component did mount and all the events, so we don't have to write it using function component. So we can create a default class, and we will call it link, and extend the pure component. So we have to import react.pure component, and we'll create an interface. So I link, we'll call it I link props, and in our interface we can pass in that link. So interface ilink props, and then we're going to pass the link that it's of types link. Make sure we import the types, and then we can return using a render method a group. Okay, so let's go back to the links, and now we can call that component we created. Okay, and then we can pass on the link. So link, to make sure it's imported. Link, so the link equal the link we're passing from the mapping, and because we're doing a mapping here, we're gonna have to put a key. So what we can do, and we've done this before, is we can create a unique key using the React UUID. And we can call our key, let's call it links dash using template style UUID. Also what we can do is we can style the links, and in order to style the links, I can do it in the CSS file to kind of keep the code clean. So we can assign a class name, and let's call it links, and then inside, oops, needs to be in quotes. So we can assign it the name of links, and inside of simple force graph SAS file, I can set up all the different links. There you go. Okay. Link, I'm returning just a group. So now that we have the actual data, we can render it what we need. We need to return a line. So we can just align everything nicer. There you go. Okay. Let's close the group and format it. Okay. And then inside the group, what we can do is we can render a line element, a line SVG element, and we can give it some properties. For the class name, I'm going to give it a link that we already have in our CSS file. So it's going to format it nicely. Now, once the component is rendered, we want to assign the data to the element. To do that, we're going to use D3, but what I can do is I can actually create a reference and use that reference instead of using D3 and select the element, just to make sure we're selecting the exact element, because we're mapping here those links items. So every time it's going to be a different class name. So the easiest way in this scenario is really to do a reference. We could have create each item its own ID, but this is just an overkill. So what we can do is we can create a reference, and the type is going to be SVG element. We used that before, or it's going to be undefined if it's not defined yet. Otherwise, we're going to have to create that object. So every time we're creating in a class component a variable that we don't want to initialize, we need to set it as undefined as well. And then what we can do is we can create a component did mount, and after the component is mounted, then we need to check, hey, is the reference got set? And if the reference got set, then we can use D3, we can put it in one line, D3, and then select the reference we're using. So this reference and then we can assign the data. To the data, we're passing from our prop. So this props link. Okay, make sure you have d3. We had this before. Sometimes it doesn't import d3, the IDE here. So I need to import it manually from d3. Okay, and now we can go ahead and assign the line to be that reference. And what I can do, we haven't done this before, but there's a little trick that we can assign the reference in one line. What we do is we set the reference, so it's type svg element, and then we assign it in line as this reference equal reference. So this way we're saving on some extra line, and we need to ESLint doesn't like what we're doing, or doesn't exactly understand what we're trying to do, because this is not the typical way to write JSX code. So we're gonna have to comment it, use a comment to get rid of those ESLint complaining. It also doesn't like that I use SVG element, because this is the line element, so we actually need to tell it, hey, it's an SVG line element, so it won't complain. Okay, now that this works, the next thing we need to do, we need to create mouse over and mouse out handlers that we can implement. So we can just create them here on mouse over handler. So we're not going to create that interactivity, we'll do it a little bit later, but I just want to at least put the handlers. So we'll use the React synthetic mouse. I could have done it with D3, but since we're trying to keep our component pure, I'll use as little as possible D3. So SVG element, and it's of type mouse event. Okay. And the other parameter is going to pass for us is the data, and the data is going to be a link of our prop type, right? And I'm just going to leave it to do here. And the same, does it want a space? Because we're not using, it's expected this. So if you don't use this instead of a class component, ESLint will complain. So we need to do that here as well. To disable ESLint errors. And the same on mouse out handler. Here we don't need to pass anything, we can just leave it to do. We'll take a look at it later after we finish and we see something printing out. It's always better to add the functionality later than to put everything right away, because then when it breaks it could be few things. And then on the line we can just assign those mouse events. So on mouse over, I can assign that method. I'm going to pass the event and then call the method we created. This on mouse over, and then it expects the event, and then I put a second property because we need the link that is assigned to this line, so we can do something with the data. So, and then the same on the on mouse out. I'm going to handle the event, and then we don't need to pass anything at this on mouse out unless we need to. So we're just going to call the this on mouse out handler. Let's see why it's complaining. Okay, let's see, we have to make sure there's no errors. Yeah, for the link, I just need to pass the props. So it would be this dot props, right? And that will have the link. Okay, so wait, I have one more error. Let's see. The D3 imports needs to be always above the types. This is a common thing. Okay, great. So I don't have any errors anymore. Okay, so now we got the links component that it's mapping through and is using the link component that we created, that passing the data and drawing a line, and then inside of the SAS file there is a link class that tells it, you know, the stroke color, the opacity is 1, and the stroke width, so it will style it for us. Okay, now that we have the links and the link, the next step is to start working on the circles. For the circles component, the process is really similar. We're going to map through our data and we're going to create a circle component. So again, create a constant, let's call it nodes, and that will equal the props dot our data, which is nodes, and then we're going to map through the data, and the type is going to be, let's call it node, and we can use types dot node to describe the data type, and then we can render our circles, so we can return the circle, and after we generate that render, we can actually do just like we did before. We can create a group element and we'll give it a class name of nodes and pass the nodes at the element. Let's get rid of the errors. It doesn't like that I'm just returning an empty tag. So what I can do until we create a component, I can just create an SVG circle and close it. That will get rid of the errors. We don't need the bracket when it's just one component, and we can actually, yeah. So now for the circle, see it wants a key as well. So we need to create a key because it's a map. So what we can do is the same way that we did before. We can just below the import, we can create a constant called UUID and require the React UUID, and then we can give the key a name using template style. We can call it nodes or node, whatever we want to call it, node, and we don't need the names. I'm just adding the name in case we need to debug it. We'll know where it came from. And then inside of the simple force graph component, we're going to create another component, and we're going to call it circle.tsx. And inside of circle, we're going to create another class. So export default class, and we'll call it circle. And that's going to extend React pure component, and we're going to pass in the node. So we don't need to create an interface since it's just one variable. We can just do types node and make sure you import the type. Okay, need a space, And then inside we can just use the same approach. We can create a reference, and our reference is going to be of type SVG. Because we're using a circle, it's going to be a circle element, and it could be undefined, so we don't need to define it over here. And then we're going to need the component did mount like we did before to set our reference. And then on the render side, we're going to return a circle. So we can just create an SVG circle, and we'll give it a class name of node because I have already a style for us. So if you look at the JSX, at the SAS file, sorry, you see we have a class for node, link, label. So we can define all of our everything here. It looks like I didn't set one for, yeah, I did set one for node. For the node, you can see just the stroke and the width of the stroke. So we need to make sure it matches. So it will render it nicely. And then for the circle, the only thing we really need to set is the radius. So we can set the radius, and then we can use the radius size that we pass from the node. So it's going to look like this. This props node dot radius size. That was part of the properties of our data. Okay, and then for the fill, we also set the fill in our data component, so we can pass that here too. So for the fill, can use this entire statement. Just use the fill node. Oops, there's an extra bracket. And fill color. Okay. Then we need to set the reference, and we can use the same style of what we did with the links. So if I go to link, see what I did? First of all, we have the component did mount. We can reuse the same thing. So let's put that here, component did mount with the reference. And then for the component itself, I can reuse the same reference style. Let's put it at the top so it matches the format we have in the other one. And then we can close our element and align it. And then the reference, when the component mount, now we're not passing the link, we're passing the node. So we need to make sure it's formatted correctly. And we need to add that ESLint. Let me see, go back to link, and you can see we have to disable this line. But one thing we need to change is we're not doing a line here, we do SVG circle element. So just make sure we have an SVG circle element. And it's going to complain, remember, because no return assign on the current line. So we need to use the same ESLint ignore. Okay. Okay, great. So now that we have the circle, we can go back to circles, and then we can replace the circle we have with the new circle we created. So it's going to be circle, oops, it's going to be circle, and we need to pass in the node. So that was a required field because we need the node to generate our circle for the circle size and the color and the fill, right? Great. Now we have that. Later on, we're going to create interactivity, and we're going to start handling mouse event to drag our circles. But for now, we just want to draw something on the screen, so we're not going to do that. Let's just make sure there's no errors. There's one error here. The imports again, D3 needs to be above the types. Okay, so circle is complete. Then the last component is the labels component, and we're just going to do the same process on our render. We're going to create a constant and we're going to call it labels, and it's going to equal the props nodes, and we're going to map through the nodes. And once we map through the nodes, we're going to take each one of the node element and we're going to return a label. So for now, I'm just going to put a label, an SVG label, and then we'll create our own custom label. And then we can assign that into a G element tag. This is the same process we've done before. I'm going to give it a class name. So we'll have style of labels. So if you look back at the Sass, we have labels. I didn't assign a style for labels, but it's good practice to have it in case we need to. And now we need to create our label component. So create a new component, and let's call it label.tsx. And in label.tsx, if we want, I can just copy the same code we did for the circle, because it's really very similar. So instead of writing the whole code, I can just use the same thing and just format it with the changes. First of all, the changes is for the class we need to use label, and for the type, what we can do is we need the node, so that's okay, it's the same. And the reference, instead of being a circle, it's going to be an SVG text element. Okay, and over here we need to change it to SVG text element, and instead of being a circle, it's going to be a text. And in terms of the property of the text, we can get rid of all this stuff. We do have a Sass. I created one for label, so it's going to give it a fill color and the font size. So we can use the class name, and then the other thing we need is, instead of closing it on text, if you remember, we need to put the content inside. So the content is going to be the properties we're passing, node, and the name. So we'll use that for our label and the name of the node. Now let me see if we forgot anything. I'm not seeing any error, so that's good. Yeah, everything looks good. So now on labels, instead of using the SVG, we'll use the custom label we created, label. And it needs the key, because we're mapping. And it needs the node we're passing. So for the key, we can use the same. I'm just going to copy it from circle. We're going to use the require React UID, and then we can give it a name of label dash UUID with brackets. And we need to assign the node element. Okay, all looking good, no errors. Now if you go to localhost right now, you could see that the elements are all at the beginning, and it's one of each. because we haven't started drawing everything. So we're going to use d3 to start draw everything. So we can close the label, we can close, no, we can leave this open. So go back to simple force graph. And what we need to do is we need to create another method that will draw those ticks. So after we're doing the simulation, we can add another method, and let's call it draw ticks. And we'll let d3 use that. There you go. And what we want to do is we want to call that method in two scenarios. We want to call it when the component is first mounting, draw ticks, and we want to call it on every update. And inside the method, what we're going to do is really two things. First of all, we're going to create those elements that we set. So the elements are node links and labels, right? So we can use d3, and then we can use select all, and then we give all the node a class name of node. So this will select all the node, and the same with the links, and the same with the labels. So you see, when we need to assign a CSS, it's better to use a class name. Otherwise, we could have used an ID. So now that we have those three main elements, we need to check if the simulation exists, because the simulation could be zero, could be undefined. So if it's not defined, we don't want to apply start drawing everything. So only if it exists, then we can call this simulation. And for the nodes, we can pass the state clone data, and then from the clone data, we really need the nodes, right? And then what we want to do is we want to put an event. First of all, this needs to be cast, because d3 doesn't know our type, so we need to cast it. TypeScript is going to complain, right? So we need to use the d3 type, which is simulation node dtom, and you can look it up at the docs. Okay. And now that we set the nodes, then we can come and say, hey, on every tick, let's start drawing everything using the simulation, right? So on tick, and then we'll do on tick handler. And what we can do is we can actually put the handler right here. So we can do a function on tick handler and handle all our elements, the nodes, links, and labels. So what we need to do is we need to go element by element and assign the attributes. For the links, we need to set an attribute for the xy, x2, y1, and y2. So it's going to look like this. x1, we're going to take the data, and we need to return the x and the y that d3 will assign to it. So we need to return xy, right? So we're going to return d. So d3 is going to create an element called source, and it will have the x, y, and target x and target y. So we need to return that. Oops. And it doesn't know a type, so TypeScript is going to complain. So a good way to handle it, we can go into types, and in types what we can do is we can create that type that we expect. So the type is going to have X and Y, right? So we can create our type, which would be export type, and we can call it point because it's really giving X and Y positioning. And we're going to expect an X and a Y. And then we can use our new type as our source. So we can just wrap the data and say, hey, the source we're going to use is going to be the type we created of type point. That will allow us to use the X and Y. And then we need to do the same for the, this is for the X1, we need to do the same for the X2, and we need to do the same for Y1 and Y2. So let's set everything up. So X1, X2, Y1, Y2. For the Y2, we just need to create, it's going to call it a target. So the Y2 is going to be the target. That's how D3 assigned those, right? So we need to just match the format that D3 will create. Okay. So one will be a source and one will be a target. And we're just matching. D3 is going to take our clone data. It's gonna add those elements for us. So we're just going to follow what D3 is doing, just to make sure it's going to render correctly. So this is for the links. Now we need to do the same for the nodes. So for the nodes, those are circles. We're going to have an attribute of CX and CY. Okay. So again, we're going to take the data, and inline we're going to return. The data is going to be the same. It's going to be a point type. It's going to bring the X and Y. So we can use the same data type and then return an X for the CX. And then for the CY, we can return the Y element. So that's for the nodes. Let's see where it's complaining. Attributes. It's missing a bracket. Okay. And then we need to do the same thing for the labels. So for the labels, we're going to have an attribute of X and Y. So we need to do, I can just copy it from the node because it's the same. Okay, labels. So, but for the label, it's not going to be a CXCY. It's just X and Y. Okay, and I'm just going to add an offset here for the labels. Now go and refresh. It looks like it's working, but there's an error here. It looks like it's pushing all our links to the top. So let's take a look. Why? Let's take a look. It's a problem with the links. So we need to look at our link element. We have X1, X2. You see we have Y1, and because I copied it, I didn't change it to Y2. So that should do it. Let's take a look. Refresh. There you go. So we got our network and it's all working correctly. And the next thing we need to do is we need to add the interactivity. We'll do it in the next section. Great.